You know, there's been a lot of talk recently about people installing Linux on their computers to get away from Windows and Mac.
If you have a regular Android phone, then clearly you have no privacy. Most of the spying and surveillance on our lives are done on these phones.
Android just doesn't work for me anymore on many different levels, and that sucks.
Something is stirring on the edges of the smartphone world, and the biggest names in tech are starting to take notice whether they want to or not. Linux-powered smartphones are rising with a momentum that nobody in the mainstream saw coming, and they're arriving with a clear message. Neither Android nor iPhone owns the future by default. An open mobile platform is now actively threatening the ecosystem control that the entire modern smartphone industry was built on, for Bill Gates. Watching this unfold carries a particular kind of sting, because if the wave of users choosing Linux Mobile keeps growing, the era of platform dominance, the very model that defined computing for decades, could be staring down its final chapter. And the history behind why this hits so personally, it goes deeper than most people realize.
As today, we're going to be installing Linux on our phones to get away from Android and iOS.
For more than a decade, the mobile landscape operated like a duopoly so complete that questioning it almost felt pointless. Apple owned the premium end with an iron grip. Google owned everything else with Android. Two systems, two gatekeepers, one reality, and virtually nobody in the mainstream. Tech conversation seriously entertained the idea that a viable third path could exist. In 2026, that question is not only back on the table, it's being asked loudly by growing numbers of users, developers, and privacy advocates who are no longer willing to accept the terms being handed to them. And the people most unsettled by where this conversation is heading are some of the most powerful figures in the entire technology industry.
Well, some of my mistakes are very public. I mean, Microsoft, we had lots of products that didn't work. We did a phone operating system, and now, Android, took that position. So I certainly, messed that up in a huge way.
Bill Gates has publicly called missing Android the single greatest mistake of his entire career. And sitting with that admission for a moment reveals just how staggering it actually is. Microsoft, the company that dismantled IBM's dominance, buried Netscape, and built the operating system that defined the PC era for a generation, completely failed to see the biggest platform shift of the 21st century coming until it was already over. Windows Phone arrived late, burned through billions of dollars, failed to attract developers in any meaningful numbers, and eventually collapsed into a footnote. Meanwhile, Google built a mobile empire on Linux-based Android and rewrote the rules of the industry entirely. The irony soaking through 2026 is almost poetic in its cruelty. The technology now threatening the very mobile order that replaced Microsoft is also rooted in Linux, the same open-source world. Microsoft spent years actively fighting on the desktop, and to understand why that matters so much right now, you have to look at what smartphones actually became over the last 15 years.
When I say Linux phones, the most popular daily driver way to do this is to use a Nexus 5 and then load Ubuntu Touch on it. Ubuntu Touch works well on a Nexus 5 and is very stable. There is no doubt that this is the safest phone available to anyone.
The original vision of the smartphone was electric, a full computer in your pocket, putting the power of the internet into the hands of anyone who could hold a screen. What it became is something considerably more complicated. Apple and Google didn't simply build operating systems. They built toll roads, and then they convinced an entire generation that paying the toll was just part of owning a phone. Every app that reaches an iPhone user passes through Apple's review process first. Every Android app distributed at any meaningful scale flows through Google Play. Every purchase, subscription, and digital transaction gets taxed by whichever platform sits underneath it. The device in someone's hand is technically their property, but the software environment running on it belongs to someone else entirely. Developers hand over 30% commissions. Users surrender behavioral data as the unspoken price of convenience. And most people never noticed how completely the ownership model had been flipped, because the phones themselves were genuinely, brilliantly designed. Linux phones are now going after this entire structure, and they're not being subtle about it.
So, this is where Linux devices like this come in. You can think of Linux as the freedom software, in that it's 100% open source. Every line of code on every app on this phone is publicly available. So, companies can't spy on you or abuse your data, because if they did, everyone would be able to see it. And so if you actually take a closer look at this Librem 5, you realize that while yes, its construction does probably resemble a graphical calculator more than it does a modern-day flagship, the privacy features are insane.
Linux smartphones don't just offer a different product. They represent a fundamentally different argument about what a phone should be and who it should answer to. Devices like the Librem 5 from Purism, the PinePhone, and handsets running Ubuntu Touch, Postmarketos, and Sailfish OS aren't competing on specs or camera quality. They're competing on philosophy. And the philosophy is radical by the standards of the modern smartphone industry. No Google account demanded at setup. No Apple ID tethering the device to a corporate identity layer before it will function. The software is open, fully inspectable, and modifiable by anyone with the skill and curiosity to look inside it. The hardware, in several cases, is built to be repaired and maintained rather than discarded and replaced on a 2-year cycle. This isn't a feature list designed to win a comparison chart. It's a political statement written in silicon and code. And it's resonating with an audience that's been quietly waiting for exactly this conversation.
The first perk is that Linux, being a simpler software than full-blown Android, with just fewer services running in the background and simpler animations, has way higher performance with equivalent hardware. Like, even though this thing's powered with a pretty weak chip, most things happen instantaneously. 2, it's stable. Because the code is public, other users can very quickly bug fix problems. Like if Samsung came out with a new Android phone and it had a major bug, you're generally just sitting there waiting for them to update it. With Linux, the power is in the user's hands. It could be done overnight.